we saw yesterday on display, on the one hand, was very heartening to see so many people come into the streets. And, you know, one of the core issues of press freedom, if this is a moment where the whole world is saying we have to have a free press, and that no matter how controversial or hateful some of the speech is, or may be interpreted in some communities, that you know, we judge a free press by how we treat the journalists or the stories that we don't like or that we're offended by. But on the other hand, this is sort of a circus of hypocrisy when it comes to all of those world leaders who were marching at the front of it. I mean, every single one of those heads of state or representatives of governments there have waged their own wars against journalists. You know, David Cameron ordered the Guardian to smash with a hammer the hard drives that stored the files of NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. Blasphemy is considered a crime in Ireland. You had multiple African and Arab leaders whose own countries right now have scores of journalists in prison. Benjamin Netanyahu's government in Israel has targeted for killing numerous journalists who have reported on the Palestinian side, have kidnapped, abducted, jailed journalists. You know, there's this controversy right now, why didn't President Obama go, or why didn't Joe Biden go? You know, Eric Holder was there already and was representing the United States. You know, I think that, you know, we should remember, and I was saying this on Twitter over the weekend, that Yemen should have sent the Yemeni journalist Abdullah Haider Shaya as their representative. He, of course, was in prison for years on the direct orders of President Obama for having reported on secret U.S. strikes in Yemen that killed scores of civilians. Or Sudan should have sent Sami al-Hajj, the Al Jazeera cameraman, who was held for 6 years without charge in Guantanamo and repeatedly interrogated by U.S. operatives who were intent on proving that Al Jazeera had some sort of a link to al-Qaeda. So, you know, while there is much to take heart in terms of this huge outpouring of support for freedom of the press, hypocrisy was on full display in the streets of Paris when it came to the world leaders. You have General Sisi, the dictator of Egypt, who apparently is showing his solidarity for press freedom by continuing to preside over the imprisonment of multiple Al Jazeera journalists whose only crime was doing actual journalism, and scores of other Egyptian journalists that never get mentioned in the news media. Another thing that I think is really absent from a lot of the coverage of the aftermath of this horrific massacre is that France also is a surveillance state. And France has a very Islamophobic position toward their immigrant community, but also toward second and third generation Arabs or people from other Muslim countries who have settled inside of France. And there's going to be an intensification of an already overreaching surveillance system inside of France. You know, some months ago I was on the show talking about the U.S. watch listing system. And one of the things that we heard when we were doing this report on how you end up on the no-fly list or on the watch list was that people within the U.S. counterterrorism community who are actually trying to prevent acts of terrorism from happening say that they're flooded in information. And that if everyone is on the watch list, effectively no one is on the watch list when it comes to actually looking at who might be engaged in these kinds of terror plots. A similar phenomenon is happening in Paris, France. You know, people talk about an intelligence failure, an intelligence breakdown. When you are putting people on these lists for monitoring or surveillance based on flimsy or circumstantial evidence, what that means is that you overload your own bureaucracy. So on the one hand, you have a surveillance state that unfairly targets Muslims and immigrants in both the United States and in France. And on the other hand, you have a system that is intended to stop acts of terrorism or to monitor people that are plotting acts of terrorism that has become its own hindrance, its own biggest obstacle to actually figuring out the reality of these plots. And let's remember, while horrifying and reprehensible, these incidents represent a relatively minor threat to Western society. You know, in terms of the actual threats facing our society, this doesn't even rank in the top 5. And so, you know, to have this kind of a reaction is not only a waste of a tremendous amount of money, but it is going to encourage, I think, future acts of terrorism.
And of course, it is a horrific moment where people actually see it before them.
Right, but you know, it's again, you know, let's remember that the United States bombed Al Jazeera in Afghanistan very early on after 9/11, then bombed the Sheraton Hotel in Basra, Iraq, where Al Jazeera journalists were the only journalists. Then they killed one of the most famous Al Jazeera correspondents in Baghdad in April of 2003, when Victoria Clark, George Bush's Pentagon spokesperson at the time, basically said, if you're an unembedded journalist, you're with the terrorists, and if you die, it's not our fault. They shelled the Palestine Hotel, killing a Reuters cameraman and the Spanish cameraman Jose Cuso. So, yes, we should be condemning any and all attacks, especially when they're killing journalists, no matter who the perpetrators are. But let's not act as though the West's hands are clean and that any one of those world leaders marching yesterday, that their hands are clean on these matters.